Hey, Kubernetes Philly, a quick note on this video. This video was originally part of ITPalooza 3D down at Tech Lauderdale, Florida. I'm adding it to our channel for posterity's sake. The March meeting, instead of canceling it when the presenter canceled, I demoed this talk that I was giving for ITPalooza with the understanding that it was going to be part of their program. So check out the link below, which is the original version of this talk. I'm leaving it here just in case that channel disappears from the internet. So it's here for archive's sake. So hit the video link below. Give it a like, a thumbs up. They did a great job at that conference, and as always, appreciate your support for Kube Philly. See y'all later. Bye. Kubernetes lets someone else run it for you. For ITPalooza 3D, March 2021. First and foremost, let's do a full disclaimer. I used to work for Rancher Labs. We're going to talk about some of their software today. I currently work for Rancher Federal, that was started by Rancher Labs to work in the government and military spaces. Both of those companies last year were bought by SUSE. And now SUSE owns both of those companies or separate legal entities under the same parent. But understand that what we're going to talk about today is my opinion. It's not the opinion of Rancher Labs, Rancher Federal, or SUSE. It is based on my 5 years working in Kubernetes, in the distributed application industry, and my experience not just with Rancher Labs software, but other pieces of Kubernetes software prior to my time working there. So let's talk a little bit about what is Kubernetes and start with a little bit of a primer. So it's basically a distributed framework, a distributed system for building distributed systems. So it does all of these things, and there's a lot that it does do for you. But the idea is that you're taking containerized software and spreading it out through your ecosystem to get the most return for your investment. Now, it started as a Google open source project. So originally they had Borg. So when you run Google Search and Google Maps and all those Google things, you're running on top of Google Borg. Now they started a second system called Omega. The best ideas from Omega got wrapped back into Borg. And then 5 or 6 years ago now, I don't exactly remember the date, it's coming up, they started Kubernetes. So this is actually a pretty young piece of software compared to a lot of the things that we rely on every day. But understand that the first commit is still very much less than 10 years old. If you're interested in the history of how Google got here, the links at the bottom are academic papers that Google has released for free about large scale distributed systems and Borg, Omega, and Kubernetes. So to understand where we've come from a software development standpoint, we went from deploying on single servers or 3 servers, in our interior environments with our traditional deployment model. Then some of us went from there to virtual environments. That's where a lot of us are today, where we take our virtual machines with our applications and our binaries and the operating system, and that's our isolation. So container deployment is one step further. We have our hardware, our operating system. Oftentimes below that operating system, we'll also have virtual machines, especially if we're running in the cloud. And then on top of that, the container runtime. And on top of that, the containers themselves, the applications, and the binaries and libraries. Now understand that the container runtime is responsible for maintaining that isolation, just like the hypervisor is. So but unlike the virtual machine, those containers are usually running in user space. Now, there are different container runtimes that behave differently and get different features for security. There are even container runtimes that spin up VMs. We'll talk about that a little bit too. And also, Kubernetes is multiple pieces of software running within your infrastructure that have different goals. So, like kubelet, there is to talk to your container runtime. kubeproxy is networking within your system. Over on the left here, you have your API, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a REST API, and this is your database for Kubernetes. And then you have links into your cloud providers, like your AKS, EKS, and GKE, among others. So Kubernetes is also software to help you run software, and it will do a lot of things for you. So a certified CNCF Kubernetes, so there's actually a certification process for Kubernetes distributions and Kubernetes services. You'll see this specific icon here with them, and it will be able to do all of these things out of the box. And there are more things that are being built that will be able to do, like, for example, a cluster API that's coming up will allow Kubernetes to actually spin up hardware on your behalf. Now, there are systems that do that today. They just don't do it attached to the Kubernetes APIs. So Kubernetes is hard. And let's talk a little bit why Kubernetes is hard. So to be good at Kubernetes, you have to understand all the things from this slide here and how they work and how they behave and talk to each other. But on top of that, you also have to be good at the database for Kubernetes. So that being etcd. Now, etcd in itself has its own difficulties as far as spinning it up and getting it running in HA. So some Kubernetes distributions will allow you to leverage other databases. So you could maybe even leverage some of the databases you've used in the past, like MySQL, PostgreSQL, or even SQL Server. Now, on top of that, you also have to do the underlying CRI. So the CRI is Container Runtime Interface. This is actually the set of rules that their container engines agree to follow, and you have another set of software there. So you have different options. Now, this is even all the different CRIs this isn't all the engines that implement CRI that you could run. But you see Docker, Containerd, and Kata. Docker being the one that kind of started everything. That's actually kind of being phased out of Kubernetes, just not right away. Containerd is the front runner, and Kata can even spin up VMs on your behalf, but there are lots more. And then, as well as that, you'll need to know the underlying CNI, or Container Network Interface. And so these are four different CNI plugins right here. You have Calico, Canal, Weave, and Cilium. And they all behave differently in how they interact between the containers and the underlying network. So and they all behave a little bit differently. They'll have different security features. Some can be encrypted, encrypt the packets as they go, like Cilium. Others can't, like Flannel, which I don't even have on this list. And then you have ones like Weave that have the interesting network paradigms between network level 3 and 4. So you have to be good at that too. And so we go back to all these things that Kubernetes does for you, and that's great. And let's say you get good at Kubernetes, but to actually run a service that your applications can run on, that your developers can find useful, and that you'll be able to monitor and maintain, so you know when things are going wrong, right? You need more. So you need things like application migration, because you're going to, if you haven't adopted containerization yet, you're going to have to do that. API gateways and service meshes become important to distribute and load balance traffic coming in. Logging changes, especially if you're in a .NET world where you're used to logging to a file or logging to the event viewer in Windows. And then on top of logging, you have things like tracing and metrics and event tracking under observability. Also, because you're in a distributed system, you're not always going to know where your things are at runtime. So you're going to need a way to persist if your database has changed a little bit. And then on top of that, you'll need CI/CD, and you'll probably need some sort of compliance engine and container registries if you haven't gone through that yet. Now, fortunately, it's not that hard because the CNCF has you covered. Joking just a little bit. So this is the CNCF landscape. So the Cloud Native Computing Foundation isn't just an organization that has software like Kubernetes, but all these other software that does all these different things, and they've got you covered. So if you want application migration, containerization tools, you've got this set. Which one should you pick? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. And I'll kind of put that under the conversation of how I pick Kubernetes distributions, for example. If you want API gateways and service meshes, well, we have some of those too. And logging and observability and persistence and storage. And now, notice that I highlighted both databases and cloud native storage mechanisms. So you can even have cloud native storage mechanisms running inside of your data center, so your data center can behave like the cloud, even without spending big dollars on something like Azure Stack or Google. I'm liking on Google with Google software, but Google has on-prem software as well, and Amazon is working on I think it's EKS Anywhere or AWS Anywhere, and then you have CI/CD and compliance and container registries. But let's take a look at these, because gives you an idea that this is the scope of the CNCF landscape. This is kind of everything that falls under the CNCF umbrella. So let's take a few of these. So we'll take a look at Rancher. Drag it over here. So we have here Rancher Kubernetes. So this is the Rancher Kubernetes distro, also known as RKE. There's also RKE2 now, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And here you can see information about the company, their GitHub, their Crunchbase information, what their first commit was as far as their software goes, how many people contribute, their level of funding. So a lot of companies on this list are funded by venture capital. Now, Rancher was bought, so this actually needs some updating because Rancher was bought by SUSE, and now it's part of SUSE, and that would change what their funding looks like. And SUSE actually has some things in here too. If I click over here on Kubik, I know this is one of theirs, and you can see, where they don't have a funding thing because they're not well, they're owned by a VC firm right now or an equity firm. Yeah, they're owned by an equity firm right now, but they don't have like a funding level like you would with a venture capital funded company. Let's look at one of these. So K3S, we'll talk about in a few minutes. K3S is a really lightweight Kubernetes platform. It's great for edge computing. It was actually started by Rancher Labs and then donated to the CNCF, and the CNCF decided to take it on and continue it through the process of going through what they call sandbox into through their incubation period before they graduate and become a graduate project like Kubernetes. So you can see here contributors funding, and so some of even here this isn't really the funding is actually CNCF funding. That's really not an up-to-date number because they make money by things like KubeCon and donations from companies, but I guess that was their seed funding to get them started. Let's take out one more at Red Hat OpenShift. So OpenShift we'll talk about as well. Was started by Red Hat, and this is backed by a much larger company with instead of a funding level, they have a market cap because they're a huge giant company. I still remember back in the late 90s when they were just a scrappy startup. So it's kind of cool to have seen them grow over the years and be a major part of the CNCF and a major part of contributing to open source Kubernetes. So let's talk about when you should use Kubernetes. When should I decide to adopt K8s? And there are a couple of reasons when. You're doing like e-commerce, you've got to run massive scale that's that has to be elastic and spin up things and spin down things, and or you've tried doing containerization yourself and you've hit the limit of what you can do yourself. Generally it's we're running scale, we have to deal with scale. Or you've already gone whole hog into microservices and you want to manage these microservices, and this is the way to go. And then option 3, you're a software developer and the company said we're doing Kubernetes. And that's usually how it starts, is the company is bought in hook, line, and sinker to Kubernetes, whether it's the right decision for them or not. But now you get to run with it. And I'll say another area where Kubernetes really shines is a unified API for application deployment scale. Like the most powerful thing about Kubernetes, and I don't talk about it in this talk, is the Kubernetes API. So you should when should I run K8s? So it's when should I use K8s versus when should I run K8s? You should run K8s if you're in a hybrid cloud scenario, because you're going to cross cloud boundaries between on premises and in the cloud. When air gap is required, so if you're like military or in a financial situation where that's required. When there's a regulatory need, so for some regulations you need to have things on site. That also tends to overlap with the military as well. Or you're experienced. You've been running somebody else's Kubernetes and you're ready to take it on, and you can get good ROI, or you just want to use the new alpha level features that aren't in EKS, AKS, GKE, or some other service, or again, your company hasn't given you a choice. So let's talk about how to pick a Kubernetes distribution. First and foremost, it should be CNCF certified Kubernetes. If it's not that, there's no guarantee that you could get off of it onto something else. I would also say these things. One has a strong user base, and how do I mean strong user base? One, there's a lot of GitHub contributors, so it's not just three people in the basement. That it has lots and lots of users asking questions on places like Stack Overflow. That you can get commercial support for it, and then we'll talk about open source versus open core. Open source being I can use it for free because I can download the software and do it all myself, versus open core, where the internals are open source and I pay for the extra. And we'll talk about the difference between those as we talk about the ones that I recommend. So I recommend one of these three things. And the reason I recommend these three specific distributions is they're the easy button. They're the easy button for Kubernetes if Kubernetes had an easy button. So the first being K3s or K3s. This is a lightweight Kubernetes where all of the alpha and things like that are ripped out of the source before it's built, and it makes it a much smaller binary. So it can run on a Raspberry Pi, but it can also run in your data center. So it's not just for the edge. Originally was marketed for the edge, but it's really Kubernetes anywhere. RKE2, so that's Rancher's Kubernetes engine. This is great because it's FIPS compliant Kubernetes. Now that's really important to the military, and in some cases to financials. And the last is OpenShift. So this is the difference. So RKE is open core. RKE is open source. OpenShift is open core. And the primary difference is going to be what you have to pay to enter into these. So OpenShift is a PaaS. It's a PaaS built on top of Kubernetes. They have their own fork of Kubernetes, and it's very opinionated in how you should do things, how you should build software, and how you should do security, things of that nature. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you want those guardrails for your company. And you do see OpenShift bought by massive organizations that spend lots of money to get it implemented, and more to keep it maintained. That's, like I said, it's not a judgment thing. It's just one way of going about it. The other is RKE. RKE is open source, so you can start for free. The downside is that you're on community support. Now, everything you see here, you can buy commercial support from a company for. So, for OpenShift, you go to Red Hat. For RKE and K3s, you could go to SUSE, or I believe Canonical for a while also did support for the Rancher stack. So, and let's say you're a really crazy person and you have to do this on-prem. I also recommend that you take a manager along with you, so that the manager is going to help you spin up Kubernetes distributions, and help you maintain them and do RBAC on them automagically. So these are kind of like the easy button on the easy button. So the first being Rancher. Rancher is Kubernetes management for on-prem, for the cloud, and even for like importing other clusters. I used to be field engineer for them, so I have deep background in this. I also use OpenShift professionally at an older job. So OpenShift is both, like I said, it's a PaaS. It's a PaaS on top of Kubernetes, so it has its own management system for Kubernetes, for OpenShift Kubernetes. So understand, if you're bringing in an OpenShift cluster, it's going to support OpenShift Kubernetes. So you're not going to do AKS, EKS, GKE attached to OpenShift. And the third here is Gartner. Gartner actually has SAP behind it. So SAP started this project as a management system for Kubernetes, and has continued to. It is not like giving it to everyone, but continues to maintain it. So let's talk about Kubernetes services. Here are what we should talk about as far as Kubernetes services go. One, it has to be CNCF certified. Maybe open source, maybe not. So AKS. All the things used to build AKS, as far as the Kubernetes distribution goes, is concerned, and the CNI plugin is all open source. So feel free to go poke around the source code of AKS, but not everyone's that way. But it's not, I would say it's required, but consider it. Existing contracts. You may have an existing contract with AKS, or with Microsoft, with Amazon, with Google, that provides you free Kubernetes, essentially, or enough Azure credits to make it worth your while. Go do that. There's no reason not to. All of the major players are close enough in features and close enough in things they could do and cost. That's a minor concern. So if it's just a contract, that might help make you the decision. The same goes for existing relationships. Like if all of your solutions architects are Red Hat people that eat and breathe Red Hat, and they love OpenShift, then that might be the way to go. If your people are diehard Microsoft and you're a .NET shop and you've got lots of Azure credits, go to Microsoft. Any regulatory concerns. So there might be, you might need FIPS, you might be FedRAMP, you might have things that the SEC needs, you might be under GDRP. Those are things that are going to affect your decisions as far as what you can run in Kubernetes. And then SLAs. Read the SLAs. So the three major players, GKE, AKS, EKS, all have SLAs that say they have a 99.5 guaranteed uptime, and I think AKS has said they'll be unofficially 99.9, or 90. I think 99.95 and 99.99 are what their SLAs say. So read the SLAs, make sure that works for you. That's important to the conversation, because AKS didn't have an SLA behind it until last year. So there were a lot of production systems that were running without an SLA and didn't really even realize it because they didn't read the fine print. So read the SLAs. So what's generally not an issue today? Cost. They all cost about the same, give or take. Now, some of their SLAs allow for refunds for failure. So keep that in mind. Uptime. So uptime, they all support the same uptime, and some of them, like I said, they do refunds for downtime based on the SLAs. Speed. Now, there are some differences in actual spin up speed, but once they're up, it's really their network runs the way their network runs. So if you're comfortable with speed between Azure nodes, it's the same thing for Kubernetes nodes. Extra feature wise, they're all copying each other. So they all do it in their own language. So, for example, if you see GKE and you need a sudden burst for containers off Kubernetes, you can throw them to Cloud Run. And if you're on Azure, you can spin up extra pods over on Virtual Kubelet, which will spin them up in Azure container instances. And Amazon was backed by Fargate. So, very similar feature sets as far as how they do, multi-region and things of that nature. They all kind of, like I said, they copy each other in their own ways. So if you're comfortable with that, there's no reason to say, well, GKE is so far ahead of AKS because multi-region, that's just not the case. And upgrades. Now, I will put an asterisk on upgrades. GKE does better than anyone. So I would say GKE does the best than Azure because they push some things with Azure, and then so EKS has what's called a shared responsibility model. You take more responsibility with EKS than you would do with AKS or GKE. So here's my personal ranking. So if you're going to do one of the major cloud providers, and you don't have it, this is assuming no existing relationships, you're starting from scratch. Start with Google. They are the gold standard for cloud Kubernetes. It's the fastest to spin up. They have multi-region solve. Their upgrade is better than anyone. Their container operating system they allow you to use is excellent. I would say next is Azure. So Azure went and hired Brendan Burns, who helped build Kubernetes. So he's been the principal in charge of getting AKS and Azure or distributed cloud stuff up, and it shows. They continue to improve monumentally, and then EKS. There's nothing wrong with EKS. That's just they started late. They don't have they don't feel as solid as the other two just on a day-to-day basis. Plus, you're kind of stuck in Amazon's paradigm for building everything. So the way they do IAM, and that you're going to be in that you're going to be the Amazon world. Now, you may have already been to the Amazon world already. So if you're comfortable, by all means. And the smaller cloud providers, I would say if you don't need all the bells and whistles of the major cloud providers, you get more bang for your buck with either DigitalOcean or Linode. Full disclosure, Linode has sponsored some of the talks I've given, as well as the user group that I run in Philadelphia. So just disclosure there. But I've used both those. I like them both. I trust them both. And will save you some money over the major cloud providers if all you need is Kubernetes and not Kubernetes plus. So if you want more information, StackRox, recently bought by Red Hat, did a great breakdown of EKS, GKE, and AKS. I can't recommend that more. It's a really excellent breakdown of those things. So with that being said, I'm about at my time. So my name is Jason Van Brackle. You can find me at these links. I stream fairly regularly on Twitch. I end up on YouTube, and you can always hit me up on Twitter. So outside of today's conference, if you have any questions about Kubernetes, if you want to see some 101 stuff, I'm going to start a whole series on Kubernetes 101, going through the APIs, setting it up, starting after this conference. So a week or two after this conference, I'll start a series out there on Twitch, and feel free to hit me up. So with that being said, thank you so much for your time. I'll talk to you here at the virtual conference, and feel free to follow me in the community and ask any questions. I'm more than happy to help, and y'all have a great day.